Welcome to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher, where we take you behind the scenes with peak performers to learn what makes them tick and discover how you can apply their lessons to your life. I'm your host, Molly Fletcher. We all have stories about why our lives are a certain way. Stories help you make sense of your life, but sometimes they can also keep you stuck. Today, I'm talking to therapist Lori Gottlieb. She's the author of the New York Times bestseller, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, and writes the Dear Therapist advice column for The Atlantic. Every year, nearly 30 million Americans sit on a therapist's couch, and some of these patients are therapists. Yes, it turns out even therapists need therapy. Maybe You Should Talk to Someone brings to life stories from the therapy couch, based on Lori's experiences as a clinical psychologist and a patient. In today's conversation, we talk about how to defeat toxic thinking, change our self-limiting narratives, and get unstuck. Lori shares how to take control of the story you've been telling yourself and become the editor of your own life. It's about changing your narrative to change your life. Let's dig in. Here's my conversation with Lori Gottlieb. All right, Lori, thanks so much for coming on. This is going to be a great conversation. It's going to, I think, help a lot of people. So thanks so much.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So you start the book with this note, right? This is a book that asks, how do we change? And answers with, quote, in relation to others. So I really want to start there. I think a lot of people think of therapy as, self-work, which of course it is. But I love this distinction that you're making. Can you, kind of expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people think that the way that they change is they make a decision to do something and then they do something different. And it doesn't work like that. There's a lot of sort of behind the scenes work that happens before people make changes. It's not the Nike, just do it.
Right.
Which is why New Year's resolutions tend not to last very long.
Sure.
So, we go through these stages, and I think that when I say we change in relation to others, usually it's because we have some kind of outside support, and people don't realize how important that is.
And sort of building off that, you note that therapy isn't just for sort of insight, right? That it has to be accompanied by behavior change, which I love. Is that a struggle for a lot of people? I mean, I would imagine so, right?
I think it is. I think there's a lot of stigma that prevents people from going to therapy, and there are a lot of misconceptions. And so, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, I really try to show what it's like, what the experience is like, and how people grow and change from that experience. I think a lot of people think that therapy is like, you go and you talk about your childhood ad nauseum and you never leave and nothing ever gets accomplished.
Mm-hmm.
In therapy, it's what you said about insight is the booby prize of therapy, that you have to be vulnerable in therapy. You have to take off the mask. You have to tell the truth of your experience. But at the same time, you have to be accountable. And by that, I mean, there are people who will go to therapy and they will say, oh, now I understand why I haven't been applying for those jobs. Or now I understand why I keep getting into that conflict with my partner. And I'll say, okay, well, did you do something different? Well, no, but now I understand it. Well, that's not helpful.
Sure.
You have to not only understand why you're doing something, but then use that knowledge to make a different choice.
Is that sometimes a misconception in the world, right? That you go and you have these conversations and maybe you're vulnerable and maybe you're accountable, but you've got to go put in the work to change the behavior, right?
You do. It's a lot of doing work. It's not coming in every week and downloading some kind of issue and, we call them problem of the week. You're not there to download the problem of the week and then leave, and then the therapy session is sort of exists in its own capsule. You have got to use what you gained from that hour during the week So we really want people to be the person that they came in as is going to manifest differently in the world than the person they leave as. And one of the things that I also say about that process is that part of therapy is getting to know yourself, but part of therapy is also getting to unknow yourself, which means it's getting rid of the kind of faulty narrative that you've been telling yourself about yourself so that you can not be trapped by that narrative.
Sure. And you know, for those who haven't read your book, which by the way, what are they waiting for, right? It's awesome. And it chronicles your own experience with therapy. And so I guess one of the questions how would you describe your experience as a therapist going through therapy, right? I mean, I sort of feel empathetic for your therapist to have to be, I mean, you know what I mean? Guiding you through this. Woo. Tell me a little bit about that, right?
Right. So, you know, in the book, I follow 4 main patients as they go through various things, and they're very different kinds of people on the surface. But I think that they're also very similar underneath it all, the way that we all have these universal struggles that we go through. And then the 5th patient in the book is me, as I go through my own struggles and I go to see a therapist. And I think what's interesting about that is that I say at the very beginning of the book that my greatest credential is that I'm a card-carrying member of the human race, that I use my humanity all the time in the therapy room. I wouldn't be a good therapist if I didn't use my own experience as, you know, knowing what it's like to be a person in the world. And I think that when I went to therapy, there's a tendency in the beginning to kind of try to seem more put together than I was at that moment in time when I was going through something in my life. And yet that goes away very quickly. You're just a person in the room when you're going to therapy. And I do all the things with my therapist that my patients do with me in terms of, you know, keeping the mask on, not really talking about what I should be talking about, but talking around it in all kinds of ways, self-sabotage, you know, not being willing to look at my blind spots. And that's normal in the process. So I think that it's really helpful. I think that we see ourselves more clearly through the lens of other people's stories. And so I think that it was important to tell my story and include it in there along with the other patient stories, because really, we're all so similar.
Is that what bubbled up in you that made you say, you know, this is a book I need to write? I'm going to grab these different personas, if you will, that were real to you, right? And certainly your own. But that this is...
Well, they're real. Yeah, I mean, they're real people.
Sure. That this story will transcend to other people.
Yeah. Oh, I think that, you know, the feedback has been that I think every reader sees themselves in these people, and you see yourself in all of these people, even if they look very different,
right?
You know, in terms of age and gender and the kind of personality they have and their history and the kinds of problems that they're coming in with. You know, that's why so many people are reading this book. And in fact, if I knew how many people were going to read this book, I might not have been so open with my own story. I remember when I turned in my first draft, I thought maybe 3 people will read this book, and now we're like almost a year on the New York Times list. And so it's a lot of people are reading it. And I think it's because I was so real. And I think that's what really helps people is to say, oh, I see myself in this person, or I see something about myself that I hadn't quite seen in the same way before. And now I know what to do about that.
That's cool. You know, it seems as if people come to therapy for a myriad of reasons, right? But if you had to say why most people are there, what would you say is at the core?
I think that there's something that's not working in their lives. And so that can be a lot of different things. It could be something that has to do with their relationships. It could be something that has to do with the way they're functioning. You know, are they functioning in the way that they want to be functioning? Are they kind of stuck? A lot of people come in with this feeling of stuckness, like something's not quite right, or I'm not really living up to my potential, or I feel like I'm missing something in the world. I feel like I'm missing something in my life. I don't feel alive. That's another one. I don't feel alive. This isn't how they describe it when they come in.
Right.
This is sort of the thing underneath what they come in with. So I always say that I'm listening for the music under the lyrics. The music, the lyrics are, you know, I'm having trouble with my boss, you know, or I'm having trouble with my partner, you know, and the music is, well, what is the underlying struggle or pattern that got you into this place in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the work is about.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the most common defense mechanisms you see, right? I mean, you've been in the room a lot.
Yeah, well, humans are really creative when it comes to avoiding feeling what we're actually feeling. And so we defend against them because we're so afraid of our feelings. We're so afraid that, there are sort of quote unquote good feelings and bad feelings. And even take the case of envy, right? People feel like, well, I'm a bad person if I were to share how envious I am of that other person. But I always say, use your envy, follow your envy. It tells you what you want. So instead of kind of marinating in your envy, use it as a clue. What is it telling me about something that I want to create in my own life, and what steps do I need to take to make that happen for myself? So when we're feeling anxious or sad or envious or whatever it is, what is that telling me about what is not working in my life so that I can do something different?
I know I had a conversation with Glennon Doyle the other day, and we were talking about pain, and she's a big proponent of feel it all, feel everything in life and feel that pain. And that's kind of what I'm hearing you say, right? Stay in it, navigate it, and learn from it.
Well, our feelings are like our GPS. And
Right.
if you don't want to access your feelings, you're walking around with a glitchy GPS.
That's a cool
You are.
analogy.
You don't know where to turn. And so here's what we do when we don't feel our feelings, right? It comes out in a short-temperedness, in an inability to sit still, in self-sabotage, in what my colleague calls of the internet. She said it's the most effective short-term non-prescription painkiller out there. So, you just go down the internet rabbit hole and you just distract yourself from feeling anything. And our feelings are so powerful. They're the most powerful tool we have to know which direction to go in.
You do, I know, Lori, a lot of couples therapy. What are you most often sort of seeing happen there in the room that has escalated in maybe a couple's life, right? What comes up often in those moments?
I think what comes up is that people feel that their partner is doing something to them to make their life worse. Right? So a lot of people come in and they say, I want things to change, but what they really want to change is they want their partner to change. They don't look at their own role in it. So how I start couple sessions is I always say to people before they even step foot in my office, I say the first session, I want you each to come in with something that you want to change about yourself that you think will make this relationship better.
Wow,
so no matter what the other person does, what is it that you are going to work on for yourself?
That's
and
cool.
One of the things I love about couples therapy is that we are truly revealed when we show up with another person. In our relationships, all of the stuff that maybe we can hide in a one-on-one session, you can hide for a little while at least, it comes up pretty quickly when you see someone interact with somebody where the stakes are really high for them.
Sure, I bet. It's easy to walk into the room by yourself, close the door, and tell your story.
Right.
Yeah.
And, I'll have people tell their stories as a couple. They don't have to even tell their stories. I'm watching their story unfold in front of me. I'm watching what they're doing. Things like, somebody will say to another person in a couple, you never listen to me. And I'll turn to that person and I'll say, how well do you listen to him or her?
Sure.
It's hard to be heard if you don't know how to listen.
Well, that's good. Yeah, throw the mirror up. No question.
Yeah.
One of the biggest takeaways for me in the book is the power of story, and I'm a big fan of this. And you say, quote, we are all unreliable narrators of our own lives, right? You say, we're all unreliable narrators of our own lives. Can we dig into that a little bit and maybe tell our listeners what you mean by that?
Sure. Yeah, that is so important. I just did a TED Talk about that. And it's about how when people come in, and not even in therapy, but just the way we move around the world, we are so sure that our version of a story is the accurate version. And I don't mean that people are purposely misleading. Most people are not. What I mean is that there's so much that they're leaving in or leaving out, or they're emphasizing or minimizing in the telling of the story because they want you to validate their position. They want to feel seen and heard and understood. And so they make sure that they're going to tell the story in a way that leads to that. And yet, I talk about the difference between idiot compassion and wise compassion. So idiot compassion is what our friends do with us. We go along with the story. We say, yeah, that guy was a jerk for, breaking up with you, even though we know that that's happened to this person the last 3 times because maybe they, don't know how to trust, or there's something that they're doing that leads to this outcome every single time. Or, yeah, your boss is, that was so horrible that your boss gave the other person the promotion. You deserved it, even though we know that maybe this person isn't really a team player or doesn't really get along with his or her colleagues, or doesn't really put in the work in the same way that the person who got promoted did. And so, but we just offer that idiot compassion because we feel like that's how we're being supportive. It actually doesn't help them. What a therapist will do is offer wise compassion. Wise compassion is holding up the mirror to someone and saying, I want you to look at yourself and see yourself in a way that maybe you haven't been willing or able to do. And we're going to do it with I use the word compassion because we're going to do it with a lot of compassion. But seeing this about yourself is going to free you.
Which makes them want to open up, right? Because that's a great word, free you. That feels good. That feels fun.
It does. It's liberating to be able to say, I am not a victim of something out there. I am not a victim of all these circumstances out there. I actually have agency over the outcomes of so many things in my life, but I need to see what my role is because whatever I'm doing is creating an outcome that I don't want. Now, that's not to say that there aren't, people out there who are contributing to that. We have this saying in therapy that before diagnosing someone with depression, make sure they're not surrounded by assholes, right? So, right. So I'm not saying that there aren't, other factors, happening at the same time. But then even if there are difficult people out there, what is your response? We get to choose our response in every situation. And is your response exacerbating the situation, or is your response doing something to set you free?
So stories can keep us stuck, right? What should people change if they're going to put some work into getting clear on the stories they tell themselves that keep them stuck in a place that isn't serving them?
Well, I think the first thing is to have a lot of compassion for themselves, because sometimes the reason that we skew our stories is because we have a lot of shame around a certain part of the story that we don't want to include, because we know that we had maybe some role in what's not working. And we feel so much shame around that. We feel like, well, that won't reflect well upon me. And so I think that nothing good, no growth or change has ever come from self-flagellation. Short-term change sometimes does. You can sort of self-flagellate yourself and say, you have to do this or do that. And, maybe that'll work for a little while, but it doesn't last. The way long-term transformation happens is when we have a lot of compassion for ourselves at the same time that we hold ourselves accountable. So if you can have those two things going on at once, which is compassion, self-compassion, and then also self-responsibility. Those things go hand in hand. You don't have to self-flagellate. You don't have to beat yourself up. I had a patient who had this voice in her head, like we all do, that was so critical, but she couldn't see it. And so I told her to go home and to notice the voice and write down everything that voice said to her in the course of a few days, and then we talk about it the next week in our session. So she comes back the next week, and she says, she's got this piece of paper, and she says, I can't read this to you. I am such a bully to myself. And then, she started to read it to me, and there were things like, God, you made that mistake again. You are so stupid. Which, by the way, if a friend made that mistake, not only would you not say it, and this wouldn't be idiot compassion, you actually would not think your friend was stupid.
Right, sure.
Right? Or just things like, are you really going to eat that with those thighs?
Right.
These kinds of things like, or just, oh, look at all the couples. You'll never find anyone, walking down the street. I mean, just the voices, we don't realize how unkind we are to ourselves. And being unkind gets in the way of seeing ourselves clearly. Because when we're unkind to ourselves, the shame builds up, and then we don't want to look at ourselves in a way that maybe is a little bit more objective.
One of the things I found so fascinating when reading your book is your background, right? You started, I mean, this is amazing, right? You started off in TV, working for NBC with
Hmm.
Friends, and ER became kind of this must-see TV, right? And then you go to medical school, and then ultimately become a therapist and a journalist. And these may seem like really separate paths, but obviously they're really connected. How does all of that give you such a unique perspective to serve your clients and really the world through the words that you have put down on paper?
Well, I feel like everything that I've done, even though all of these careers look so different, had to do with story and the human condition. So
Mm,
when I was working in film and then over in network television, I felt like we were telling these very rich human stories. Certainly on ER, because nobody goes into an ER where you expect something to happen. So there
mhm,
are always these inflection points. But when I was working on ER, we had a consultant who was an actual ER physician, and I would spend time in the ER doing quote unquote research with him.
mhm,
And what I really connected with were the real human experiences. So there was one thing to tell the stories in a fictional way on television, but seeing them happen in real life was something that was just, it felt much more profound to me. And so that's when I went to medical school.
mhm,
And I went up to Stanford, and when I was in medical school, it was the end of the first, near the end, we didn't know it then, of the first dot-com boom and about to be the first bust. And a lot of people were talking about how the medical field had changed and there was managed care, and I wouldn't be able to really engage with the human stories that I wanted to engage with because of the way the new medical model seemed to be going in. And so I also started writing at that time, and I left medical school to become a journalist where I felt like I could help to tell people stories.
mhm.
And I did that for many years. And then I also, I still do that. But in the middle of all that, I had a baby. And one of the things that happened was I felt like I needed to talk to adult humans during the day. And the UPS guy would come and he would be delivering packages to me. And I'd sort of detain him just so I could talk to another adult. And I'd say things like, how about those diapers? And,
Uh-huh.
do you have kids? And he would sort of back away to his big brown truck. And I thought, okay, I need to do something about this.
Mhm,
And so I
mhm.
called up the dean at Stanford and I said, listen, maybe I should come back to medical school and do psychiatry. And she said, listen, if you do psychiatry, you're welcome to come back, but you will mostly be doing medication management. And if you want to do the human condition and story and all of your interests and have those connections, why don't you go to graduate school and get a degree in clinical psychology, and then you can do the kind of work you want to do. And that was exactly what I did. And so I feel like everything that I did was simply approaching story and the human condition from a different angle. And as I say in my TED Talk, I feel like as a therapist, my job is really that of an editor, where people come in
Mhm.
and I help them to edit these faulty narratives.
Mm,
And I help them
that's
to
cool.
untangle their stories. Whatever their first draft is not serving them anymore.
Mhm.
And so what we're working on is we're working on their life stories and what edits need to happen so that they can live in the way that they want to.
We'll get right back to the show, but first, I want to share with you a free video series that I created just for you. Too often, we assume that our potential is some lofty vision hanging over our heads, but never quite attainable. But in reality, our potential is built in small moments. A pro athlete delivers a clutch performance in the biggest games because he executed it 1,000 times in practice. The same goes for you. Master the little moments so you're ready for the big moments. My free Unleash Your Potential video series walks you through 3 simple steps to move closer to what you really are capable of. To get free access, visit 5minutepotential.com. That's 5minutepotential.com. One of the things that we deal with so often in the world is change, right? And people often make the connection between pain and loss, but there's such a deep connection, right? Even between change and loss. And I've heard you talk about it. Can you dig into that a little bit? Because I think it's powerful, the connection between change and loss.
Yeah, so many people wonder why they're not changing when they know exactly what they need to do to change. And part of the reason has to do with the fact that change and loss are tied together, that you can't have change without loss. And people say, well, wait a minute, I'm making a positive change. So what are you talking about when you say loss? And what I mean is that we lose the familiar. So let's say that you want to make a change and you know that it's going to be a positive change, you're still losing something that is certain for you. Even if the certainty is something that's unpleasant or miserable, right? It's still familiar. And there's comfort in that. Humans don't do well with uncertainty. And so most of us don't. So even if we're going into something positive, it's uncertain. We don't know what it's going to be like, but we sure know what the current situation is like. Sure. And it's kind of like a warm blanket. It's like you don't necessarily, you maybe need a new blanket. The blanket might be kind of torn and kind of gross, but you know what? It's your blanket and you know what it's like to be wrapped in it. And then all of a sudden it's like you're going to have to go into this new place, like going into a new country or a new culture. You don't know you don't know the language yet. You don't know what the mores are in this culture. You don't know how to be. You don't know what to expect. And so I think a lot of people want to cling to what they know. And so we do have to give up something to get something else. And I think that if we don't acknowledge that we're giving something up, it's harder to change.
And you talk about the 5 stages of change, and how that shows up. Can you break that down?
Yeah. So before we even get to the place of what we call action, we go through these different stages. There's pre-contemplation, where you don't even know that you're considering making a change. There's contemplation, where you're sort of thinking, maybe I need to do something about this, but you're not really ready to do it. There's the stage where we're sort of taking some action, we're preparing. It's called preparation. Maybe you're like Googling and doing some research about the change that you want to make. And then there's action, where you actually make the change. But that's not the end. That's not the last step. The last step is maintenance. And maintenance is, how do we maintain the change? So, we see this a lot with, let's say you want to stop smoking, or you want to stop drinking so much, or, you want to, there's some habit that you're trying to change. Those kinds of things, we see it a lot. But also, how we see that in relationships, where sometimes somebody has a maladaptive pattern that they keep repeating over and over in relationships, and they take action and they want to change, but then sometimes they kind of regress and they slip back. People will, in the maintenance phase, slip back. It's it's normal. That's what you should expect. But then how do you go right back? How do you recover from that? And so the people who have the resilience there in that moment of they regressed, okay, you don't beat yourself up. It's those people who they go on diets and they're like, okay, they did really well, and then all of a sudden, oh wait, I had like 3 pieces of cake. Well, the whole diet's blown. Forget it. I'm just going to give it up, right?
Right.
As opposed to, okay, so I had 3 pieces of cake and tomorrow I start again.
Yeah.
And, not like, oh, all is lost. So the maintenance is actually one of the harder stages of change that people often ignore, because they think, well, I've made the change and I'm done. No, you're not done. You have to maintain it until it becomes a regular part of your life. And then it becomes much easier.
I think this is interesting. One of the most, I think, powerful characters in the book is Julie. And without giving everything away, ultimately, you're sort of helping her come to terms with her own death. How did that change you, and what did you learn from her?
So Julie is this young woman who comes to me. She had just returned from her honeymoon, and she felt something in her breast. She thought maybe she was pregnant, and she wasn't pregnant. She had breast cancer. But she had this very treatable form of breast cancer. And so she came to me not because she thought she was going to die, but because she wanted to get some support as she was going through her cancer treatment as a newlywed. And she did get better. And when, and she left after the treatment ended and her scans were clean. And 6 months later, she needed to get a sign-off scan so that she could try to get pregnant. And she called me. I hadn't spoken to her since I had seen her when she left, and she had the clean scans. And she told me that on these scans, they discovered a different cancer, and it was a very rare, aggressive form of cancer, and it was going to kill her. And so she asked me if I would stay with her until she died. And at the time, I had no experience doing that with someone like Julie, with someone young. And I really didn't want to get it wrong.
Right.
She would only have one chance at this, and I
Sure.
certainly wanted to make sure she had the experience that she wanted. But she insisted. She said she didn't want to be with the cancer people. She wasn't one of these sort of pink ribbons and optimism, and that didn't work for her. And so what she did for me was really make me sit face to face with my own mortality. That it wasn't just Julie who was dying. Obviously, there was something, imminent for her, but really made me think about the idea that life has a 100% mortality rate, and most of us don't know when or how we're going to die. And so what does that do? Well, it can either depress you, or it can help you to live with more intentionality in your life. So I think it really made me, and you can see in the book as I go through my own therapy that I came in for one thing, which seems sort of, very clear cut at the beginning as we talk about unreliable narrators and skewed stories. And what you see is that there were all these other things going on, and seeing Julie really made me examine the bigger picture and made me think about, what do I want to do with my life while I am still alive? And I don't just mean breathing, but I mean while I'm healthy enough to do it.
Sure. Right.
While I don't want to live, there's another patient in the book that I see, and she's an older woman. She has so many regrets about her life and things she did do or didn't do, and I think that we don't want to live with those kinds of regrets. We want to say, I had my eyes opened, and I made these choices. Even if you make choices that maybe you feel like maybe that wasn't the best choice, at least you were thoughtful about the choice, even if it didn't work out the way you wanted it to. And so I think what Julie can do for all of us is to help us to kind of keep the idea of our mortality sitting on one shoulder, not in a morbid way and not in a way that, we obsess about, but just in a way that invigorates us, in a way that makes us feel more alive and more aware of, do I need to spend 3 hours on Instagram?
Right.
Or,
Sure.
is there something else that I want to be doing? What is the meaning and purpose? What matters to me? What matters to the people around me? How am I going to live in a way that feels consistent with my values and with what I want to accomplish?
Boy, I bet that was a powerful experience for you on so many levels. I mean, you just broke it down a little bit, and I'm sure that we could go on for hours just on that.
Yeah. Well, there's a reason there's a tissue box on the cover of the book.
I know. When we think about what have you learned, right, in these moments, I think some people come to therapy, sort of seeking forgiveness or wanting, to forgive maybe someone else. What have you learned about forgiveness in all of the work that you've done?
Well, that woman that I just mentioned, the one who had lived with so much regret, one of her regrets was that she had not been the parent that she had wished she had been. She made significant mistakes in raising her children that, had an impact on them. And so her adult children are estranged from her. And she wants to repair those relationships, but the way she's trying to repair them is by wanting to explain herself to them and wanting them to forgive her. And what I told her was that that's forced forgiveness. That a lot of times people do this to people all the time. They say, oh, you need to forgive. No, you actually don't. I think you can have compassion for somebody and their situation, but you don't have to feel something that you're not actually feeling. You can't actually make yourself feel something that you don't feel. And so I think that the way that she was able to come toward her children and have them come toward her was to find a way to forgive herself. That the only person that she needed forgiveness from was herself. That if she could find a way not to excuse herself or not, again, going back to accountability, not hold herself accountable for what she had done, but to find a way to forgive herself. At a certain point, I said to her, how long do you think the sentence should be for your crime? Is it a life sentence? Because so many times we give ourselves a life sentence for things that we've done.
Yeah.
When maybe we don't need to. Maybe we can let ourselves out of jail. And so she needed to forgive herself and come to some kind of reconciliation with herself around the choices that she made. And then what she really needed to do was to, in the present, become the kind of mother that they needed now. And the more she could become the kind of mother that they needed now, instead of trying to make up for something that happened in the past, the more they said, oh, yes, we can come toward you while you're being the mother that we need now. Nothing will change the pain of the past, but we can change what's happening right now in the present. And I think that therapy is so much about the present. So many people think that you come to therapy and it's all about the past, but really it's so focused on the present and what you can do now in the present and how the present informs the future. So the choices you're making now in the present will inform how the future unfolds. And that's really the focus. And so many people are just living in the past. And we as therapists, ironically, are saying to people, we need to get you up to speed here. We need to get you up to the present.
You know, you said the word compassion, and I love how you deliver. You call it loving truth bomb, right? Like a loving truth bomb.
Yes.
And so it's sort of that is wise compassion. How do we get there? I mean, like, you're a trained professional, but there's something we can learn from it too. I think myself and all of our listeners, sort of these loving truth bombs. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's when I go back to self-compassion. I think the more compassion we have for ourselves, the more compassion we have for others. And so when we talk about the difference between idiot compassion and wise compassion is not, it's kind of like the message under wise compassion is if a fight breaks out in every bar you're going to, it might be you. That's the message we want to tell our friends when we see them over and over doing the same things, and yet we're always saying, oh, that's terrible that this happened to you, even though we know that there's something that they keep doing that is landing them in the same place.
Sure.
But I think the truth bombs are what is really going to help people. That's where the wisdom comes in. But you deliver it with compassion. It's not you do this, or it's more asking them questions to get them curious about themselves. So, well, what do you think? Why do you think this keeps happening? Or what do you think is going on here? And it's timing and dosage when they're in the throes of that they're smarting from the pain. That's maybe not the moment, but maybe the next week. Right? Maybe 2 weeks later, maybe it's not one conversation, but several conversations. And I think that's the most loving thing we can do for the people we care about, is to help them to see something about themselves that will help them to live in a way that feels better.
And it's important for all of us, isn't it, that we have people in our lives that do this for us, right? That serve us in this way, that aren't afraid to give us loving truth bombs, right? I mean, that's key, I would imagine.
Right, and I think that's what trust is all about. That when you have that trust with somebody, that they are going to hold you in high regard at the same time that they're going to point out the ridiculousness of what you're doing. That those two things coexist. Because human beings are ridiculous. We all are.
Right.
And we need to laugh about it. We take ourselves so seriously.
Yeah, sure.
The more we can laugh at the ridiculousness of the ways that we get in our own ways, the easier it will be for us to see them and to make changes.
Yeah, well, I tell you, I'm so grateful for my parents and my husband, right? They drop those loving truth bombs, but with love, and they're moments that you remember, right? I remember lots of them, but they're pivotal in our lives. Was there any fear around, I just wanted to ask you this question and we'll wrap here, but was there any fear around putting yourself out there like this while still practicing as a therapist? Because as you say this in your book, that often when patients see your humanity, they leave us. So tell me how that showed up for you.
Yeah, that's true. I think that most therapists are really hesitant to disclose anything about themselves. And I want to make a distinction that what I write in the book, I would never obviously break up in a therapy session.
Right.
So I guess the best way to describe it is that first, I really did not think that the book was going to be so widely read. So I think that I might have wanted to kind of clean myself up a little bit if I had known, but I'm really glad I didn't.
Yeah,
because I think that's the power of the book is the power of the honesty and the candor in the book. But I think the other thing too is that when the book first came out, I went on book tour, and I didn't tell my patients where I was going because I never do. I always say I'm going to be out on such and such a date, and this person's on call for me. And so when I came back from book tour, and at that point the book had kind of exploded, I came back to the office, and some people came into my office and they sat down on my couch and they said, "So, I read your book." And it was really interesting because the conversations that they wanted to have weren't so much about me because they'd read what they read about me in the book. they wanted to have conversations about us. And a lot of what I write about in the book is the relationship, right? When we talk about how we grow in connection with others, what does it look like to have this very intimate relationship with somebody that's also a very professional relationship, but it's also a life-changing relationship. And it's intimate in a way that we will talk about things that sometimes people will not talk about in any way, shape, or form with the people out there in the world.
Absolutely.
It'll be a different conversation.
Sure.
And so, or I'm the first to hear it. And I hear this difference, especially when the difference between, and as a generalization with men and women, where, men will come in and they'll say to me, I've never told anyone this before. And then I wait to hear what they're going to say. And what they say feels so mild to me so much of the time. And I feel so much compassion for them. Like, really? You had no one to say that to? And these are people who have a lot of people in their lives, too. They have friends. They have a partner.
Sure.
And so women will come in and they'll say, I've never told anyone this before, except for my mother or my sister or my best friend, right? So they've had maybe, 1 to 3 people that they've told, but they feel like they haven't told anyone. Whereas in our culture, it's so not okay for men to be vulnerable that they literally have no one that they've told before. I'm the first person to hear something most of the time. And so I think that's what people want to talk about when they come in, they've read the book, is they want to talk about, now I have permission to talk about what's going on between us in a new way. They've known that because I work very much in a relational way in the room. But I think now, that moment in the book where I say to my own therapist, do you like me? And now I've heard stories of people going into their therapist and saying, I read this book, and in the book, the person says to their therapist, do you like me? They're indirectly sort of asking their therapist because they can't really get the question out.
Right.
But I think what it's also doing is it's helping people to see our work in a deeper way, to see more of, what we've been talking about and just have it reinforced. And I think that's what it does for the reader too. I think that it's one thing for someone to say to somebody, you have this habit of doing this, or here's what's getting in your way. But I think it's very different when you're reading something and you recognize yourself in somebody else and you say, oh, that's me.
Super powerful. It's super powerful the way you wrote it. No question. Tell us about some of the projects you have coming up, right? Including, I know you have a TV series produced by Eva Longoria, right? And a podcast.
Yeah. So the book is being adapted into a television series, and Eva Longoria's company is producing it. And the creators of the show, The Americans, are writing the pilot right now for this show, the first episode.
So exciting.
And so that's very exciting. And I hope that also makes, what I really want to do with the book is bring our emotional health and these conversations around emotional health, just normalize them. And I think that the TV show will do that even to a greater degree. And I still write the weekly Dear Therapist column for The Atlantic, and I'm launching a new podcast with iHeartRadio that Katie Couric's producing, and it's called Dear Therapist, and it's me and Guy Winch, another therapist, and we are going to be unpacking letter writers' issues. And then we are also going to do something which I don't get to do in my advice column, which is they're going to go and try the advice, and then they're going to come back and tell us how it went.
So cool.
And so we get to see what worked, what didn't work, and learn a lot from that experience as well.
Yeah, that's cool. We end, Lori, with rapid fire, so I'm going to hit you with a couple quick questions, and you just fire what comes up. All right?
Sure.
Morning person or night owl?
Night owl.
Which is harder, being a therapist or the patient?
Patient, definitely.
Okay. What's the last book you recommend, or what is a book you recommend?
I loved Olive Again by Elizabeth Strout.
Oh yeah, she's fantastic. Person you would play, a person who would play you in a movie or a TV show?
Ooh. I'm leaving that up to the casting people.
Okay, cool. What makes you laugh?
Oh, everything. This is so interesting. So I just wrote a piece for the New York Times about how I tweeted out in the middle of coronavirus. I said, if I can't touch my face soon, I might have to go to therapy. And, I think that humor is so important, especially, not in spite of, but especially in times when we're struggling. So I would say humor is something that is, I try to find the humor in most situations.
What makes you cry?
Also everything. I think that
Yeah.
people who are aware of what's going on around them will feel very deeply. And I think that we always say that you can't mute one emotion without muting the other. So you can't mute pain and then also feel joy, right? If you mute one, you're going to mute the other. So I think just as much as I laugh, I think I am apt to cry.
What's the best advice you've ever received?
The advice about going back and being a therapist.
Yes. And I think the world would thank them for that advice too, in light of the contribution you're making, which is awesome. So the show's called Game Changers. So one last question. Who or what is a game changer that inspires you and why? So it can be a person, dead or alive, that inspires you and why.
So a week ago, my father died.
I'm sorry.
He is the person who inspired me the most in my life because of his emotional generosity. And that is a quality that I value so much. And I think that having emotional generosity, if you can find your place of emotional generosity, that will be a game changer in your life too. That I think that emotional generosity is the key to changing our lives. So I would say that's the biggest game changer.
Wow, that's fantastic. Well, Lori, thanks so much for joining us. This is a terrific conversation that I know will help a lot of people, and I can't speak highly enough of the book. It's really a page turner. It's a good one. Thank you for taking the time to put yourself out there. It's awesome. Thanks so much, Lori.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for the conversation.
Thanks, as always, for listening to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. There you can listen to previous episodes and leave us a review, which helps other people find out about the show. For more about me, visit mollyfletcher.com. Until next time, stay curious and be bold.